Morning everyone and welcome to the Sunday Politics. I'm Sarah Smith and this is your essential briefing to everything that's happening this morning in the world of politics. Big fines for bosses who take bonuses from firms with black holes in their pension funds. Will the Prime Minister's pledge help the government get back on the front foot after the collapse of Carillion? Leading Brexiteer Jacob Rees-Mogg says that the Lords risk fundamental reform if they obstruct the passage of the EU withdrawal bill. The Arch Remainer Lord Adonis says that's their job. We'll bring the MP and the peer together. And Henry Bolton fights to save his job after a week of damaging headlines about his relationship with a 25-year-old model. We'll talk to the UKIP leader live. It might be his last interview as party leader.
And in the Midlands, the collapse of Carillion dominates. Who will foot the bill for projects like Sandwell's new hospital? And what about the impact on jobs here? Join us in half an hour.
All that's coming up in the programme, and with me today we've got our regular gaggle of experts providing the inside track and all the big stories. Tom Newton-Dunn, Isabel Oakeshott and Steve Richards. First this morning, Theresa May is proposing what she is calling tough new rules to penalise company executives who try to line their own pockets by putting their workers' pensions at risk. An unacceptable abuse, she says, that will end. Her comments come as the government attempts to seize the initiative after the collapse of the giant construction services and outsourcing company Carillion, which went into liquidation on Monday with debts of around £1.5 billion.
One of Britain's biggest construction firms, Carillion, has been put into liquidation. 20,000 workers face an uncertain future.
Carillion employed people providing essential services in our schools, hospitals, railways and prisons. They had to be told they would be paid when they turned up to work on Monday.
And let me be clear that all employees should continue to turn up to work confident in the knowledge that they will be paid for the public services that they are providing.
The firm had around 450 contracts with government on top of private work and overseas projects. Some of those had been handed to the company after it issued profit warnings last year.
Prime Minister, why were contracts awarded to Carillion despite the warnings?
Labour and the unions wanted answers.
Why did the government not heed the warnings? Why did they continue to give billions of pounds of contracts to a company that the city were backing against in 2013? That's the real question.
And it's emerged the firm's former chief executive, Richard Howson, who left the firm last year, received £1.5 million in pay and bonuses in 2016. While many ordinary employees face the prospect of being laid off, and a huge black hole in the company's pension scheme could result in their pensions being slashed. Subcontractors who hadn't been paid for weeks were warned they might get just 1 penny for every pound they're owed. Some warned that they too might go to the wall.
We're not really a business of a size that can trade through that without some form of support from the government. If it's not forthcoming, I think ourselves and lots of businesses like us will probably go out of business.
In the wake of the collapse of the contract...
For Labour, though, this was not just about the failure of one company. By Monday night, Jeremy Corbyn had taken to social media. At Prime Minister's questions, he pressed the point home.
This isn't one isolated case of government negligence and corporate failure. It's a broken system.
Virgin and Stagecoach's management of East Coast trains, Capita and Atos's handling of disability assessments, and security firm G4S's failure to provide security at the Olympics were all examples, according to Jeremy Corbyn, of the private sector failing the public sector.
These corporations, Mr. Speaker, need to be shown the door. We need our public services provided by public employees with a public service ethos and a strong public oversight. As the ruins of Carillion lie around her, will the Prime Minister act to end this costly racket?
Theresa May pointed out it was the Blair and Brown governments that signed many of the big public-private partnership deals, and she suspected there was something else behind the current Labour leadership's hostility to the private sector.
But what Labour oppose isn't just a role for private companies in public services, but the private sector as a whole. This is a Labour Party that has turned its back on investment, on growth, on jobs. A Labour Party that will always put politics before people.
So under a Labour government, how far would their nationalisation plans go? Would every binman, builder and even bankers have to be employed by the state? So Carillion's collapse is the big story of the week, and it will continue to have political consequences that I will talk through now with the panel. Tom Newton-Dunn, it's presumably the collapse of Carillion that's prompted this promise from Theresa May today that she will punish bosses who have got big black holes in their pension funds but continue to take bonuses themselves. Is this something very new?
This is very much our expectation that the Prime Minister has acted dramatically as a response to Carillion's collapse last week. The only problem is, I recall a certain party conference speech the Prime Minister gave in October 2016. It was the Citizens of Nowhere speech. He was calling out all the rotten, corrupt apples across the country then. Philip Green was prominent in that, who of course had just presided over the collapse of BHS, leaving a massive pensions black hole. An entire year and a bit has passed and no apparent government action. So I fear Theresa May, with all these bold words in the New Look Observer this morning, is still behind the curb on this. And action this day, it's still going to be looking like action tomorrow.
Yeah, but it's still what people want to hear, isn't it? That action will be taken to at least stop this happening again?
Well, certainly people do want to hear it, although they're amazed it hasn't happened before. But I think actually Jeremy Corbyn is playing this beautifully, and there is a much more worrying, bigger picture here for the Conservatives, in that the opportunity that they have created for Jeremy Corbyn to underline his case that unfettered free markets don't work, and that somehow or other Carillion symbolises everything that is wrong about the system, as we heard him say there on that clip. Now, I don't think most voters are actually particularly ideological. They just want things to work. But if the government is seen to be incompetent on this scale, it does create the vacuum for the leader of the Labour Party to put an ideological spin on it, and he's doing that very effectively.
I mean, what the Prime Minister was pointing to, and she is right, when she says far more of these PFI contracts were signed under Blair and Brown than have been under subsequent Tory governments. But now that you've got a Corbyn Labour Party in opposition, they don't really have to shoulder the blame for that, presumably, and can be highly critical.
Jeremy Corbyn opposed them at the time. I think what we're seeing here is the late 1970s in reverse. Then you had a minority Labour government being torn apart by ideological tides moving away from it. Now we have a minority Conservative government being challenged by tidal waves which put them on the defensive all the time. We haven't got time to go through other examples, but just on this one. As Tom said, Theresa May is quite well equipped in some ways to respond, because from the very beginning she taught the language of corporate governance and intervention, and we're coming after the bad people in the private sector. But because of the lack of action to follow that up, and because Jeremy Corbyn genuinely believes in these things, it's much easier for him to swim with these tidal waves than her leading this deeply pressurised minority government.
OK, well, we've been talking to all three of you through the course of the programme, but let's pick up on Carillion with the Shadow Attorney General, Labour's Shami Chakrabarti, who's here in the studio. Welcome.
Good morning.
Labour have been very critical of the government's response to Carillion's collapse. What would Labour have done differently this week after they found out how much trouble Carillion was in if you'd been in government?
Well, I think what we would do and what we will do as soon as we are in government is look in a far more fundamental way at PFI, at outsourcing. And by the way,
and we'll get on to the principles of this. But if you had won the election in 2017, it would have been a Labour government that had to handle this collapse. What would have been different in your response?
I don't think we would have left it so late. I don't think we would have just soldiered on, bailing out a company that already had raised serious warning signals in the city. I don't think we would have allowed them to get into subcontracting arrangements with, for example, Serco, worth, again, millions and millions of pounds when there are profit warnings against that company too. I mean,
but this is it now. So Serco are a big government provider. If you're saying the government should have intervened earlier with Carillion, should they be looking at all their contracts with the likes of Serco, who have also issued profit warnings?
I think you do need to look at all of these arrangements and the subcontracting arrangements. By the way, it's not because I'm ideologically opposed to the private sector, and it will be a lot of smaller private sector companies that will really suffer as a result of non-payment, for example, under contractual arrangements with these great big beasts.
So should they get some government help? I mean, we heard the man running the Small Business business in the film there, saying they might go to the wall unless there's some government
possibly,
help.
but with accountability. And I think it's all very well for Mrs May to now say she's going to sting these executives. There's got to be a little bit of ministerial responsibility in all of this as well. And one of my concerns is that when vital public services of a kind that are almost constitutional, for example prisons, get contracted out, what you're actually devolving is ministerial responsibility. And then something goes terribly wrong, whether in a vital utility or whether it's a matter of security or infrastructure, and ministers of whatever colour just put their hands up and say it's wicked executives, it's the wicked company. And what we need is ministerial responsibility. What we need is oversight. Of course we want a thriving private sector, but some vital services need to be run by public servants and with ministers held to account.
Sometimes when you hear Labour shadow ministers talking about this, it sounds as though they want to take absolutely everything back into public ownership, all the catering, all the cleaning, every service.
I believe in a mixed economy, and I know that my colleagues do too. But there are times when some things need to be in public hands. Now that will include on constitutional grounds, where you're talking about people's human rights, people's basic security. That will also mean sometimes when you have a big organisation and outsourcing is used to grind down the working conditions of some workers and break down the sense of community and solidarity between them.
So where is it appropriate for there to be private contracts?
Well, where is it? Well, for example, there are some things that the private sector probably does better. When you're running a police force, you're unlikely to say we'll make the motorbikes for the police officers better than BMW. Maybe you will, but I doubt that that's going to happen anytime soon. So you need to look at this.
But what about cleaning in the offices and the police stations? Should that be outsourced, or should that be actually run by the police?
I think that in some circumstances, I think maybe hospitals are a better example, because of course cleanliness in a hospital is quite often a matter of life and death. So I think sometimes it is better, even for something that seems not a core service like cleaning, to be in public hands. You just need to look at this on a case-by-case basis, both in terms of...
I'm not hearing very many examples of where you think it is appropriate for private companies to be involved. So you've discussed prisons and probation. What about catering in prisons? Does that have to be in public hands, or could that be done by a private company? I think
what you want to do is to look at the quality of the service, the quality of the conditions for the people working there, and to see what would be best value for the public and for the public purse. It's not ideological, but in some cases there are principles at stake. I do agree.
And we are still left with the problem here of workers who are worried about their pension, who've been working for Carillion, and subcontractors who may not get paid. If the government were to talk about putting some taxpayers' money into helping out either those people or those companies, would the Labour Party object?
I think we would want to look at what the conditions are of spending public money.
But in principle, you could spend public money on people. It's not the fault of the subcontracting small companies who are now not going to get paid.
Well, indeed, but you want accountability. If you do decide to spend public money, for example, to help those smaller businesses, you want some accountability in response. And you might well want to legislate to give priority to pension funds, for example, over shareholders who have not really done their job of corporate governance in these cases.
We'll move on and talk about something else, if you don't mind, the John Warboys case, the serial sex attacker. Yeah. This time last week, we were sitting here talking about the fact that the Justice Minister said he would launch a judicial review. Now he said that he won't because there's little chance of it succeeding.
Indeed.
Should the government be pursuing a judicial review? Would Labour, if they were in power?
My view at the time, and I decided to sort of hold my tongue about it because I'm used to politicians waving in a kind of knee-jerk way when there's a case of this kind. My view is that if there is to be a judicial review of the parole board decision, the best person to bring such a judicial review would be a victim, because the chances are their best arguments would be under the Human Rights Act, which gives rights to victims and not to politicians. So I think
there's a crowdfunding attempt to raise the money to do that.
Frankly, if the Justice Secretary wants to make a name for himself with this as a new Justice Secretary, he might better give his attentions to making sure that people have decent levels of legal aid so that they can vindicate their rights under the Human Rights Act. I also think, in relation to the Warboys case and the crisis of public confidence that it's in danger of creating, we could do with an end-to-end review of the whole case, from the moment a young woman went to the police and was disbelieved to the moment this release decision was made, arguably with a lack of transparency and involvement of victims.
Because he was prosecuted for offences against 12 women, and we know there were almost 100 other women who came forward, but the CPS say they can't go forward with those cases. They looked at them, they decided there wasn't enough evidence, and they can't revisit that decision. If there wasn't enough evidence then, there won't be enough evidence now.
I want to look at the... I'm not second-guessing the particular CPS decisions, because I'm not in a position to do that, but I do think that there are issues for the whole system. From the moment that a woman went to the police and was not treated with the respect that she deserved, to the moment that this release decision was made, it would seem, on everyone's analysis, without proper input or consultation or even notice to victims.
Now, of course, it was Labour's Shadow Brexit Secretary, Keir Starmer, who was the Director of Public Prosecutions at the time when the case was prosecuted, and he said he didn't have any involvement in the decision-making behind it.
Nor did his predecessor. He says, but that's not my point.
But they should have done, shouldn't they? Shouldn't the DPP have been looking at something? You've got over 100 women reporting that this man has raped them, and he's prosecuted for only 12 cases. The DPP should be involved in that.
Whoever was the DPP, my argument is that this whole story and this whole case and the numbers of women involved and, frankly, the anxiety that this decision has caused to women who weren't even victims means there needs to be an end-to-end review of how the system has worked in this case, from the moment a woman went to the police and was arguably not believed to the moment that this release decision was made without the input of victims, who I would expect to be at least given notice and the opportunity to make representations to the parole board.
There's a story running in the Sunday Times this morning about Momentum, saying that they're trying to deselect 50 Labour MPs.
An anonymous source has given...
Now, of course, the fact of the matter is, Momentum, where there have been parliamentary selections, Momentum candidates have won only in 5 of the last 25 selections. Does that not worry you? Do you not think that actually the Labour Parliamentary Party should better reflect the membership and Corbyn's leadership?
Look, my understanding is that Momentum is not prioritising the selection of some candidates over others. They are, an invigorated movement, part of the Labour movement, which has always had various strands within it. What is exciting to me, it's clearly not exciting to the Sunday Times, fair enough, is that we've now got about 600,000 members. And we have a democratic party that's becoming more democratic.
So you must want the MPs to be more in tune with the membership, because there is still a massive disconnect between those who sit in Parliament and those who've joined the party since Corbyn became leader.
Well, I think these things can be exaggerated. I've personally, in the Palace of Westminster, noticed a real change since the general election. People uniting around a sense of purpose, not least around scandals like Carillion. So fair enough, it's a good story for the Sunday Times, but I don't really spot this red menace in the way that other people do. This is a democratic party. It's a mass popular movement of about 600,000 people, and I think that's something to be quite optimistic about.
All right. Well, Shami Chakrabarti, thanks very much for talking to us this morning, and I shall turn back to the panel and start with you, Steve. I mean, should Labour MPs be worried that Momentum are coming to try and deselect them, or is this being rather overblown? They haven't been that successful thus far in doing so.
Yeah, no, I think it's been overblown just on the basis of the evidence. I mean, you quoted it then, of the selection procedures that's taken place so far. They haven't prevailed that often, and in the Sunday Times today they resorted to the example of Haringey Council, where I happen to live, where there are a lot of specific local issues. So at this point, it is not at all clear whether deselection will become the overwhelming theme over the next few years in the Labour Party. It might do, but the evidence so far is that it's much more nuanced than some newspapers are suggesting.
3 new Momentum-backed members on the ruling body of the Labour Party, the NEC, this week. That's going to make a difference, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely huge difference, because Jeremy Corbyn and his wing of the party can now do precisely what they want. And as long as they have union muscle behind them during conference votes, which formalise decisions made by the NEC, then the party, and any which way he wants to run it, is his. I disagree with Steve. I think, the difference in language that Jeremy Corbyn and his very close associates were using after the NEC elections this week on mandatory re-selections. Shami wasn't actually asked whether she thoroughly believed in them or not. Jeremy Corbyn was, Rebecca Long-Bailey also was, and both of them, crucially, refused to rule them out and refused even to say they were a bad thing. Simply that we hadn't taken that decision yet, we're not there yet. In my view, it is without doubt that Jeremy Corbyn will at some stage try and reshape the Parliamentary Labour Party more in his image. And you may well argue, Shami's views would be interesting, why on earth should he not do that?
And Shami was saying that the party is much more united around Jeremy Corbyn. And when we see a story like Carillion this week, it's much easier, isn't it, for him to get the backing of the parliamentary party and look like a more united
Well,
force?
I think that's right. But I mean, back to what we were talking about before, how unpleasant and how ugly and how divisive is it to have these stories out, whether or not they're completely accurate or, whoever is briefing. I think it looks very, very bad on the atmosphere of the parliamentary party. Where I do think that Shami has a good point is on the size of the Labour membership, 600,000. I mean, the Conservatives can only dream of getting a fraction of this. So clearly there is a big problem for the Tory party there in matching what Labour is doing.
OK, and so before we leave this, we should ask you, Shami, mandatory reselections for Labour MPs, are you in favour?
I think that there should, whatever democratic process there should be across the board and for everyone. My experience is that where MPs are doing a good job, including working with their membership, and you have to work with your membership to get the vote out in the Labour Party, that relationship works well, and I think that relationship will only work better into the future. I've been all over the country. I've been to all sorts of CLPs campaigning in recent times, not least because I don't have a constituency myself. And I think you'd be surprised at the number of places where there's actually a very happy relationship between the MP and the party, regardless of the particular strand that they come from.
All right, Shami, thank you very much for that. Now, the government's flagship Brexit legislation, the EU withdrawal bill, didn't have the easiest of times in the House of Commons, but this week MPs did vote to send it through for consideration to the House of Lords. A number of peers have expressed concern about the so-called Henry VIII powers that the bill grants to ministers, which means they can make changes to some laws without parliamentary scrutiny. And of course, there are a number of peers who are dismayed about the entire process of Brexit itself. So are we likely to see more dramatic attempts to change the bill in the chamber full of unelected lawmakers? Emily Price has been taking their temperature.
You'd think a bill that sought to enshrine EU law into British law after Brexit would be popular with the pro-Remain crowd in Parliament. But when the withdrawal bill cleared the Commons this week, one Tory Remain supporting MP said he hoped the House of Lords would make an enormous amount of changes. Good Lord, what are they up to?
I think what will happen is that the government will suffer a series of defeats which will reduce the power of ministers to do things without proper scrutiny and put in place a sensible series of votes both in Parliament and the people at the end of the process, so that when we do get an endpoint to Brexit, people can say that it's been done properly.
So a second referendum is on the table?
It's definitely on the table.
You'd expect a Lib Dem to say that, but some Tory peers want changes too.
If it comes to the situation where it looks as if what people voted for cannot be delivered, then we have to decide how best to move forward. I don't believe the House of Lords is trying to block Brexit at all. I think what the House of Lords is doing is its constitutional duty.
So anyone hoping that the House of Lords will deliver a fatal blow to Brexit will be disappointed. But so too will anyone hoping that the withdrawal bill will come out of there unchanged. So what is all the fuss about?
The extent of the government taking powers to itself rather than giving powers to Parliament, the Henry VIII powers. There's the issue, of course, about the kind of protections we've had under EU law that we've contributed to for consumer protection, workplace protection, environmental issues. They're coming into UK law, and that's what this bill does. But it needs to make sure they're protected in UK law. They can't just be overturned the next day. There has to be a parliamentary process to do that.
But this was the reaction when some elected MPs over in the Commons voted against aspects of the withdrawal bill, causing a government defeat. One of their own colleagues even talked of treachery. Another MP, Jacob Rees-Mogg, this week said the Lords would face reform if it tried to frustrate the democratic will of the people. So is a chamber full of unelected Remainers playing with fire?
Since I've been leader in the House of Lords for just over 2 years, what I've found is that every time someone doesn't agree with something we're doing, they'll sort of get quite hysterical about take away their powers. It's almost an off with their heads moment. But, there is quite prescribed powers we do. We take those seriously and responsibly. And if there are changes we think should be made, we'll send them back to the House of Commons.
And even one of the lesser spotted Brexit-supporting Lords isn't worried.
There are a number of Lords who are in cahoots with Messrs Tusk and Juncker in trying to persuade the British people that they made a great mistake when they voted to leave Brexit, and I've no doubt that they'll have a bit of fun doing that. But on the big issues, like whether we should have a second referendum, the Lords voted by a majority of more than 200 against that last year, or if you look at the Commons vote, where the majority was over 200 against remaining in the single market and the customs union, I think the Lords will look to the elected House and do what they're good at, which is to consider the detail.
Of course, one of the biggest differences between the Lords and the Commons is the presence of nearly 200 crossbenchers, members who aren't in a party and don't take the whip. And they include some of the most distinguished legal minds in the country. And debate over the bill's constitutional implications may well lead to more than one showdown with the Commons.
It's worth remembering that the corporate manslaughter and corporate homicide bill went back and forth between the two houses 7 times only a few years ago, and that was just an aspect of the criminal justice system. It wasn't about the biggest decision this country is taking since 1945. So I think people need to be a little bit relaxed about that.
Like the MPs on the green benches of the Commons, the Lords on their red benches agreed to trigger Article 50, but the Lords, like the Commons, is split on what Brexit should actually look like. There may be some toing and froing, or ping-pong as it's known round here, but pretty much everyone agrees the Lords can't and won't block the bill, and it'll go through, probably by the end of May.
That was Ellie Price reporting. Well, to discuss this, we're joined from Somerset by the MP Jacob Rees-Mogg. This week he was elected chair of the influential European Research Group, made up of Brexit-backing Conservative backbenchers. And here in the studio, we're joined by Andrew Adonis. He's a Labour peer who resigned from his role as a government advisor last month over its Brexit strategy. Welcome to you both, gentlemen. Lord Adonis, you've made your opposition to Brexit very clear. You recently described it as a nationalist spasm that can be stopped. Do you think the EU withdrawal bill, when it comes to the Lords, is the opportunity to stop Brexit?
Well, I agree with Lord Lisvane, who in your clip just then said that this is the biggest decision the country will take since 1945. I absolutely do not think that the Lords can stop it. This is an issue for the people. This started with the people in a referendum, and my view is that the final say should go to the people. The critical issue over the coming months is going to be the relationship between the House of Lords and the House of Commons in seeing that the people have the final say. Now, there's a lot of detail work we need to do on the bill.
When you say the people have the final say, you're talking about a second referendum?
Well, a first referendum on Mrs May's terms of departure from the European Union, not a rerun of the referendum 2 years ago, because, of course, when we had that referendum, we didn't know what those terms were going to be. And just as the people had the first say on whether to start this process, we are a democracy, we engage the people, this is the biggest decision since 1945, and the people should have the final say. Now, I think the Lords may have an important role in seeing that they do have that final say.
Mr Rees-Mogg, you're very confident that we will have a Brexit deal that will look very attractive to most of the electorate, so presumably you wouldn't be too worried about a second referendum on the terms of the deal.
Well, I think the ambition of the Lords in putting forward a second referendum is actually to try to stop Brexit, and Lord Adonis has been very clear about that. He said only yesterday that he wanted to delete all the clauses of the withdrawal bill. We have had a referendum, and we've then had a general election where both main parties backed the referendum result. I think if somebody wants a second referendum, they ought to win an election first, a general election, campaigning for one, rather than getting unelected peers to use it as a stratagem to obstruct Brexit. And it's notable that Lord Adonis and others have not called for second referendums on things like the Scottish vote, and it's highly unlikely they would have wanted a second referendum had their side won.
So, Lord Adonis, you have said that you will make the government's life an absolute misery over the EU withdrawal bill, which does rather sound as though you're using it as a stick to beat a policy you don't like or a decision you don't like, rather than your real role as the Lords, which is legislative scrutiny.
Well, there's a huge amount of scrutiny to do, as Lady Smith said in your film. The powers which ministers are given in this bill is without precedent in a single piece of legislation. They have order-making powers over the whole sphere of legislation that was previously enshrined in European law. So if the House of Lords doesn't pay attention to that, then it's not doing its role as a second chamber. But can I come across to Jacob's remarks just then? Jacob himself has been a supporter of a second referendum. In the House of Commons in 2011, he himself set out the case for a referendum on the terms of departure from the European Union if the electorate voted first time round to set the process in train. So what Jacob is doing is straightforwardly contradictory to his own position. Why?
No.
Because
he is an
ideologue. He's an ideologue who will stop
You're
nothing
shaking
to
your
get
head,
us
Jacob Rees-Mogg.
out of the EU.
Yeah, that's simply inaccurate. There was a proposal that there should be a referendum to begin a process of renegotiating our membership, to give the then Prime Minister a mandate to do it, and that he would then come back with what he had achieved, and there would be a referendum on the result. That was short-circuited because the Prime Minister decided to have a straightforward in or out referendum, and the terms were set at the beginning. So Lord Adonis is talking about a speculation, a discussion, before the referendum terms were set. The referendum terms were set. Everyone knew what they were voting for, to leave the European Union. It was clear that meant leaving the single market and leaving the customs union. And I'd put again to Lord Adonis, he would not be calling for a second referendum had Remain won.
What Jacob has just said is completely untrue. We did not know what the terms were when we voted 2 years ago. Indeed, the Conservative manifesto for the election before said that we would stay in the single market. And these are Jacob's words, because let's be accurate about this. These were his words in the House of Commons in 2011. It might make sense to have the second referendum after the renegotiation is completed.
Oh, but he says he's talking about the completely different. He's talking about Cameron's renegotiation that he went to before the EU
exactly
referendum.
the same principle applies now.
No.
We've had
No,
a
it's
negotiation.
not.
We're seeing the terms that Mrs May is coming back with, and it's absolutely right that the people should have a say on those terms, and it shouldn't be Jacob Rees-Mogg and the Brexit ideologues who decide what the terms are of our departure from the European Union.
Jacob Rees-Mogg?
Well, the difficulty with this is that people decided in a referendum. The general election manifestos of both parties committed to carrying out the result of that referendum. If Lord Adonis wants to put his case forward, he should try and stand for election, something I don't believe he has ever done. See if he can win a general election campaigning to reverse the result. What should not happen is that unelected peers should try to frustrate the will of the British people as now expressed in 2 democratic votes.
OK, so on that, Jacob Rees-Mogg, you've been issuing some veiled threats this week saying that the House of Lords would get into difficulties if they try to frustrate Brexit. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think what Baroness Smith is saying is actually very sensible, that the House of Lords will abide by the constitutional conventions, that it will look to revise. I have concerns about some of the Henry VIII powers myself, so I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing for the Lords to look at in its normal constitutional role. But if the House of Lords gets into a 1909 position of peers against the people, then the people win, and the Lords need to be aware of that. They need to observe the constitutional norms, and then everything will carry on as it is.
The Lords need to be aware that what might happen to them in those circumstances, that the government could flood the chamber with 200 new Tory peers?
Well, it's already pretty flooded, but yes, you would have to have a deluge on top of a flood. The House of Lords has to abide by the constitutional norms, otherwise the Prime Minister would be perfectly entitled to use the reserve powers to create more peers. But I hope that won't be necessary. This, again, is a conditional. It's not something that I am calling for.
Lord Adonis?
What Jacob is doing is threatening the Lords, is a Brexit ideologue who will stop at nothing to get Brexit through without the people having the final say. But what he's also doing is dodging the issue, because nobody is talking about the House of Lords asserting itself against the people. The issue which it will come down to is if the House of Lords invites the House of Commons, that is Jacob and his colleagues, themselves to reach a decision again on the issue of whether there should be a referendum on the final terms. That is not anti-democratic. That is the proper expression of democracy and the role of the House of Lords. As I say, that is something which Jacob himself has supported in the past. It's no longer longer convenient for him to recognise that fact, but I'm afraid people's past does catch up with them. His ally, Nigel Farage, has now come to support a referendum on Mrs May's Brexit deal because he realised it's inevitable. My own view is that in the coming months, as people realise the gravity of this decision and the fact that Parliament itself is not in a great place to take it because there has been a referendum, I think the case for a referendum on Mrs May's terms will be unstoppable, and the House of Lords will play an important democratic role in inviting the House of Commons to reach a decision on that.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, it would be ironic, wouldn't it, if the British Constitution, working its way through as it does, the House of Lords making revisions, sending them back to the Commons, for you to argue against that when what you wanted was us to take back control of our own government?
I'm all in favour of taking back control and decisions being made in the House of Commons with the Lords acting as a revising chamber. But you have to understand the motives of people who want this second referendum. They are trying to obstruct Brexit. Lord Adonis compared the decision to leave as big a mistake as appeasement in the 1930s. There is deep-seated, almost hysterical opposition to the Brexit decision by the Remainers, and they are using this as a stratagem to frustrate Brexit. But what they should do is not use the unelected Lords, but they should campaign in a general election if they've got the courage to do it, which the Labour Party notably didn't in 2017, to call for a second referendum and a reversal of the result. But they don't have the courage to do that because they know the British people aren't with them.
OK, let me ask you one slightly different thing, Jacob Rees-Mogg, before we finish. Are you excited that the Bayeux Tapestry is coming to Britain? You don't think this is maybe a bit cheeky of the French to be sending to us something that celebrates a Norman victory over the English?
Well, I think it's absolutely great. I think it's a splendid gesture, and I'm sure many people will want to go to visit it. And we could send them in return a fragment of the Union Jack from Nelson's ship at Trafalgar, which was sold last week, as a reminder that, by and large, we win the battles.
Any idea what we could send them in return for the Bayeux Tapestry?
Well, some people have suggested we should send Jacob in return, but the problem is the Bayeux Tapestry is much more recent in its views than Jacob for the most part. However, on this big issue of Brexit, the crucial thing is that we'll have to leave that there. Lord Adonis,
Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you very much for that. And you can find more Brexit analysis and explanation on the BBC's website at bbc.co.uk/Brexit. It's coming up to 11:40 and you're watching the Sunday Politics. Coming up on the programme, we'll be talking to embattled UKIP leader Henry Bolton ahead of his make-or-break meeting with the party's executive. First, though, it's time for the Sunday Politics, where you are.
Good morning and welcome to the Sunday Politics here in the Midlands. Coming up in today's programme, the collapse of Wolverhampton-based Carillion. What happens now, who foots the bill for projects like Sandwell's new hospital, and what will be the long-term impact on jobs and the economy here. And we all want cleaner air, but is a tax on vehicles the way to deliver it? It's an idea that's gathering speed. Joining us today is the Attorney General and Conservative MP for Kenilworth and Southam, Jeremy Wright, and the Labour MP for Wolverhampton North East and former Shadow Communities and Local Government Secretary, Emma Reynolds. Welcome to both of you. But we start today with what Jeremy Corbyn called the outsourcing racket. Labour has pledged to make the public sector the first choice when it comes to providing public services. The comments came as the National Audit Office revealed that private finance initiatives will cost the taxpayer close to £200 billion over the next 2 decades. Research by the Birmingham Mail last year put the regional bill at around £20 billion for, amongst other things, hospital projects like the Royal Stoke in North Staffordshire, Hereford's County Hospital, the Royal Worcestershire in Worcester, and the biggest of them all, of course, the flagship Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Birmingham. Now, PFI was supposed to be about delivering value for money. It doesn't seem like that is happening, Jeremy. Is this ideology, is this policy dead in the water?
Well, there's a fair amount of ideology in what the left wing of the Labour Party are saying about PFI, and they have a
fairly implacable hostility to the involvement of the private sector in almost anything. What PFI does do is enables you to deliver certain things, schools, hospitals, earlier than you would otherwise be able to do. That's an obvious advantage. It also transfers some of the risk of, for example, construction cost overruns onto the private sector rather than onto the public sector. But there's no doubt about it, PFI has its problems. When we came into office in 2010, we ended some PFI contracts and we've changed the way in which they are now done. But they do bring some advantages as well as disadvantages, and we should keep that in
Emma,
mind.
is that fair enough? Because, of course, it was a Labour government which rolled out these PFIs, which negotiated many of these contracts. Have you changed your mind about this?
Well, I'm proud that a Labour government invested in schools and hospitals, and generations of children now have been to those new schools and those refurbished hospitals and schools. So that's a good thing. I don't see this as a black and white issue. I think some of the PFI contracts that were negotiated were perhaps not value for money, and some of the evidence that we've seen recently has borne that out. But in other cases, it did work, and it did mean that we could deliver those improvements in public services at that time. But I do think we need to have a review of the PFI contracts in place going forward so we can see where we can get the best value for money.
OK, Emma, thank you very much. Now, the collapse of Carillion has been felt more keenly in this part of the world than almost anywhere else. The company has its headquarters in the Midlands, and some of its biggest ongoing projects are also here, among them a major new hospital in Sandwell. While the ideological debate about how to fund big public projects rages on, thousands of workers and apprentices and hundreds of small companies simply want to know what's going to happen to them. Peter Wilson takes a look now at how events unfolded.
Building work at a standstill. Workers sent home. The new Metropolitan Hospital in Smethwick was one of Carillion's biggest public sector projects. The question from the local MP to the Minister, what now?
What is the government going to be doing about ensuring the flow of funding and work so that the contract can be completed and we can look forward to the opening of this new much-needed hospital?
Carillion's HQ in Wolverhampton employs 400 people. The MP for the area summed up feelings among staff.
A news that probably felt like a bomb had hit them.
Do you know if you'll lose your job?
No idea.
Do you know if you've lost your job or not?
Don't know. It's very disappointed.
Very disappointing. Some say it will be far worse than that, with predictions that Carillion's demise may cost thousands of jobs.
It could be absolutely incredibly devastating for our small businesses, both locally and nationally. At the moment, they don't know if they're going to get paid, where their jobs are going to be, and who will take these contracts over. We need reassurance, both from government and from the banks, from other areas, how those contracts will work, who will pay for them, who can take them over.
Work at Birmingham's Paradise Circus is also halted, and there's now uncertainty about some of the contracts around HS2. Carillion's Apprentice College in Birmingham will also close at the end of this month.
I was really looking forward to having a career with them, and being able to have a good job, good secure job, and being able to progress and learn new skills. And then now it just seems like it feels like a kick in the stomach.
An emergency task force has been set up by Wolverhampton Council to try to minimise the impact on small businesses.
We know that Carillion has got a very long supply chain in the West Midlands and in Wolverhampton, and what we want to make sure of is that the small businesses that are obviously expecting some payments, the small businesses that have gone out and bought equipment, small businesses that have paid their workers, we want obviously to try and do the best that we can to make sure they get paid, to keep our local businesses in business.
The government is confident work on the big projects will begin again soon. The questions now are when, how much will it cost, and who will pay the bill?
That was Peter Wilson reporting. Well, also joining us today is the Small Business Commissioner Paul Uppal. In a previous incarnation, Mr Uppal was the Conservative MP for Wolverhampton South West before losing his seat in 2015. Welcome to the programme, Paul. We heard there the situation in Wolverhampton and the rest of the region. How difficult is this for small businesses at the moment?
I used to run a small business myself, which is, I think, why I actually secured the position of Small Business Commissioner. It is a hugely worrying time. There's a great deal of uncertainty, and obviously, at the moment, I think what small businesses need is reassurance.
Reassurance, but what is actually happening? Can you tell us any more about that?
Well, in terms of the Commission, I'm very lucky. I've got a small team, a handful of people who come from a real business background, real relevant knowledge. What we can do is we can signpost small businesses if they want to contact us at the Small Business Commission. We can also provide generic advice. Construction doesn't come under our remit, but one thing I'll be doing is certainly making sure that at Westminster at the national level, we can actually take forward a message about early payment. That's a big part of our remit in the Small Business Commission. Government often sort of trails the fact that it will pay on 30-day terms. I would like to see, in terms of speaking to the receiver, to make sure that we can actually carry that out with public contracts, and that will give small businesses more confidence.
So that would be a practical step. Emma, this business has collapsed in your city. What are people telling you locally?
Well, this is a kick in the teeth for Wolverhampton and indeed our region, and people are very, very worried about their jobs. What's going to happen to the 400 people employed at the HQ in Wolverhampton, and what's going to happen to these small businesses in the supply chain, many of whom were subcontracted by Carillion to provide public services, and in some cases on private contracts as well. Are they going to get paid for the work that they'd already done? And if they don't get paid, then they perhaps are going to have to lay people off. So there are thousands of people across our region facing an uncertain future, whereas the former chief executive of Carillion was paid £600,000 a year to basically do nothing when he resigned from his job.
Yes, and Jeremy, there is growing anger about this, not just things like the money paid to the former bosses of this company, but there is growing anger about this. We're hearing a lot of warm words from the government, but are you doing enough?
Yes, you're hearing much more than warm words as to what the government's going to do. I think Emma's right. The first point we have to recognise is how worried people are going to be about their own futures and money they've already earned. And what the government has done already is to say, when it comes to public service contracts where Carillion's been providing a public service, the government will step in to make sure those contracts can continue, so people have that reassurance. As it happens, the liquidator has also been able to make sure that the vast majority of the private sector contracts that Carillion had can also be continued in a service way. So there is some reassurance there. We've also, I think, as Paul mentioned, we've got to think about what the supply chain of Carillion is experiencing at the moment. And what the business secretary has been able to do is to get together with the banks and make sure that there's a substantial amount of money provided by the banks to smooth the path for those who are in the supply chain, who may be small businesses with contracts with Carillion. Huge amount for us to do. When it comes to bonuses, absolutely people will be worried about this. The liquidator has the power to look at bonuses that have been paid and decide whether there's been misconduct by the directors, and if there has, to recover those bonus amounts. That's absolutely right. Everything the Prime Minister's been saying since she came to office is that we're in favour of responsible capitalism, and Carillion needs to demonstrate that like everybody else.
But the government, I'm afraid, is behind the curve on this. It shouldn't take the collapse of Carillion for the government to realise that there's a big, big problem here. The differential between the people at the top of these companies who are winning hundreds of contracts from the government, being paid exorbitant amounts of money, in this case £600,000 basically to sit on his hands, Richard Howson, and in other cases perhaps even more than that. We need to have a look at the pay differentials between those people at the top and your regular employees, often facing insecurity at work. The other thing we need to ask the government about is, when did they know that this company, Carillion, was in trouble? They didn't have a Crown representative who's there to monitor the contracts that the government has with these companies between August and November of last year, and apparently it was September when the financial situation really deteriorated. Why was that the case? What did the government know, and what could it have done to prevent the collapse of Carillion?
Well, can I say that there were people looking at the difficulties that Carillion were experiencing, and everything possible was being done by Carillion and by others to try and make sure this company could continue. Sadly, it couldn't. But it isn't right to say that the government didn't have its eye on the ball here. And can I say, I mean, in relation to whether or not the government was continuing to supply work to Carillion, the government wasn't the only one. There were Labour councils that were giving Carillion very large £100 million contracts right up until the 8th of January this year. And the final point, just to say on bonuses and on pay differentials, absolutely right. We should have greater transparency so that people can see what the differences are between what people at the top of the organisation are paid and what people at the bottom are paid. This government's doing something about that. I'm afraid the government Emma supported did nothing about about it, despite the presidency.
There is clearly lots of blame to hand
Absolutely.
around, but Paul, practically where we are now, this is the situation we have. What are you going to be pushing for with government to try and alleviate these difficulties for some of these businesses in the West Midlands?
Well, I think particularly in terms of credit lines, it's important that make sure the banks do get monies out there. But taking things forward for the future, I think one thing that would be really useful, and a small business commissioner that I want to really champion, is make sure we get more small businesses involved in tendering for government contracts and actually then procuring them and actually then carrying them out. The problem is that for many small businesses, they don't have the time to do that. And if we in the Commission can help small businesses, guide them and signpost in terms of going forward with that, I think that'll be much more useful and long-term much more sustainable in terms of the future of the services we provide.
OK, Paul, thank you very much. Now, air quality in urban parts of the West Midlands is amongst the worst in the country. The Metro Mayor, Andy Street, has already said he's prepared to consider charges to deter the most polluting vehicles from our city centres. Birmingham City Council is also getting in on the act as it prepares its own plans for a clean air zone. Our reporter Catherine Stancheshin has been finding out more.
There's something nasty out there, and it's choking us up. Pollution in the West Midlands is worrying those who say there's little more important than the state of the air we breathe. Our elected mayor started the new year saying it's a priority.
A really damaging issue is the nitrogen oxide pollutants. 1,300 premature deaths last year based on air pollution. We are going to have to act in the West Midlands, and actually my view is that the public want that to happen as well.
In Birmingham, it's reaching crisis point. The World Health Organization saying last October the city's air is too dangerous to inhale. With high levels of polluting particles, including main culprit nitrogen dioxide, the consequences are very real.
We're not talking about the old smogs that killed loads of people, the pea supers. We're talking about something much more invisible, but it's killing us. We have to take some action now, but also in the long term.
Birmingham's been told it must clean up its act by 2020. And just before Christmas, the government gave it a deadline of September to have its final plans in place.
A Birmingham City Council Cabinet report next week is expected to say the worst offenders will be charged, mostly diesels.
We are looking at a clean air zone. If we just took off the HGVs and changed the buses, would that give us clean air by 2020? The suggestion is it won't. So we have to go a step further. Do we have to actually need to take some polluting cars off our streets? And the answer would look to be yes.
We'll get the details next week of exactly who will be affected and where across the city. Leeds and London already announcing they're bringing in their own clean air zones. The upgrades needed to comply with the new rules could prove extremely costly for some local businesses.
£20,000 per bus. Across all of our fleet, that's about £560,000, which is a huge amount to find in the space of 2 years. So we'd look to Transport for West Midlands to provide some assistance with all of that. And the alternative, if we weren't to be given assistance, would be that our bus fares would have to increase very substantially.
Research shows that 80% of the poor air quality in Birmingham is caused by transport, but just 50% of the vehicles in the city centre actually come from the city. Last year in Solihull, the Green Party decided to put up their own air pollution monitors.
In Shirley alone, we picked 2 sites along the A34. Both of them came back with illegal readings.
They're concerned that people living in neighbouring areas will help pay for Birmingham's clean air without feeling the benefit themselves. They also say public transport is key.
Well, we've seen the cost of public transport disproportionately increasing. So car travel has come down in price and bus travel and train travel has increased massively, and that's completely the wrong way round.
Of course, most people would agree their politicians should be taking care of the public's health, but the question remains, just how much should a breath of fresh air cost?
That's Catherine Stancheshin reporting. Jeremy, you go pretty much anywhere in a taxi these days and the taxi driver will tell you that this is terrible, it's going to happen, and they're very worried about it. What do you think?
Well, I think everyone's worried about having to pay extra, especially to get access to a city centre. But we do need to do something about this. And as the report shows, this is a problem that's particularly acute in central urban areas. It's not uniform across the country, of course, and if you look across the UK, then the emissions of nitrogen oxides has come down by a little under 20% since 2010. But in particular areas, we've got a particular problem. And I think it's the responsibility of all of us to look at imaginative solutions. It's not just about charging people more money, by the way. It's also about keeping the traffic moving. If you have a lot of congestion, you have a lot of pollution. So traffic movements are important. We want to see more electric cars, and the government's doing what it can to encourage them.
It sounds as though you're saying that you think charging might be an OK idea.
Well, I think it's one thing you can consider, but I think you have to make sure you've targeted it in the right way, and I think you need to consider other things first. But if what you're talking about is charging for the entry into already very polluted areas of the most polluting vehicles, then I think it's an option. But if you look at what we are already doing, there's a good deal more progress to be made. So take, for example, the fact that this country is the country where there are the greatest number of sales of electric and hybrid vehicles across the EU. We're already making progress, but we can see from the results that are being obtained in air testing that we've got more to do.
Yeah, and Emma, what do you make of this? Because, of course, we've had congestion charging in London for many years, but the economy here in the West Midlands, in a city like Birmingham or indeed Wolverhampton, is very different. Can we afford this? Can our businesses afford this if it discourages people from coming into our city centres?
The question really is, can we afford not to tackle this? Because experts estimated that last year 40,000 people are dying from air pollution. People who live in cities are worried about walking with their kids to school. What effect is it going to have on their children's health? So yes, it may cost a little bit more. Some of these measures may be a bit uncomfortable for business and for individuals, but what is the alternative? Is the alternative that 40,000 people a year are going to suffer as a result? So I think we really need to answer this question as what do we see as more important? I think it's more important to improve air quality so that people's health doesn't suffer.
And if you think it's more important, how much would you like to see a big SUV being charged to drive into the city centre of Wolverhampton?
Well, I don't know exactly, but I would like to see something being done about the old diesel cars, which are one of the worst offenders when it comes to air pollution, because I think unnecessarily these cars are allowed to pollute the air in a way that we could reduce. So, you know, I'm not going to put a price on it. I'm no expert on charging vehicles to drive into cities, but I do think, as Jeremy says, it's one of those options that we've got to consider. And it seems that the Mayor wants to look at it for Birmingham.
It does seem that way, and that was a skillful swerve around the idea of it. Could I ask you, Jeremy, do you have an idea of what might be a reasonable amount?
Well, I don't think it's sensible for Emma or I to try and guess what the right figure should be, I'm afraid. But look, just to add to what she says, with which I mostly agree, I think that actually it's not good for businesses either to have a town centre or a city centre which has very high pollution levels. It doesn't attract people in if the atmosphere is that bad. So I think it's quite important for businesses, just as it's important for residents, to have this issue addressed. And there are a number of ways we can do it, but we do have to consider all the options. And if one option is to charge people for entry to the city centre in certain circumstances, in certain vehicles, I don't think we should take it off the table.
A sort of consensus, but perhaps the fact that we're not talking about amounts points to the fact that there is a little bit of political sensitivity on this issue. Right, time now for our regular roundup of the political week in the Midlands in 60 seconds. It's brought to us this week by Nick Watson.
350 home care staff held a rally in Birmingham over proposed changes to their shift patterns. Birmingham City Council says it's addressing their concerns. One of the region's UKIP MEPs led calls for his party leader Henry Bolton to quit after allegations his girlfriend Jo Marnie made racist remarks about Prince Harry's fiancée Meghan Markle.
He has to go, and I will be resigning as a spokesman within his team and encouraging members of our party to urge Henry to leave for the good of the party and, of course, for the country.
Former PM Tony Blair was among politicians who paid warm tributes to the BBC WM broadcaster Ed Doolan, who's died at the age of 76 after a long battle with dementia. Football fans joined a minute's applause to celebrate the life of Cyril Regis, who died suddenly last week. The former Albion star broke down racial barriers in the world of football and beyond. And a cross-party group of 17 West Midlands MPs is supporting the growing campaign, calling for the broadcaster Channel 4 to relocate to a new base in the West Midlands.
That's Nick Watson, and we'd all like to pay tribute to Cyril Regis and to Ed Doolan, as we heard there, who we sadly lost this week. Emma, thinking about Channel 4, as we just heard, you're one of 17 MPs locally who have kind of endorsed this idea. But Channel 4 are not making very positive noises, are they?
Well, I think that's a bit premature. I think it would be fantastic if Channel 4 came to the West Midlands, and in particular to Wolverhampton, which is something we're campaigning for. And my colleague Eleanor Smith, who's the MP that represents the city centre, has been leading on this, and I very much support that. I think that Channel 4 coming to the West Midlands would be a great fit for our region. We're a very multicultural and diverse region that is full of talented people who could work at Channel 4, so I hope that they will come our way.
I'm sure you would endorse that, Jeremy.
Well, I would, except I think the perfect home for Channel 4 would, of course, be Kenilworth.
Kenilworth.
But I will settle for the West Midlands. And I think, actually, what we need to recognise, as much as anything else, Channel 4 needs to recognise, is the UK is about much more than London. And we need to get some of these institutions outside the capital city so that we can spread the wealth, spread the benefit. And I think that's one of the benefits we would get from moving Channel 4. If they need a little nudge to experience what good things the West Midlands has to offer, then we should offer them that nudge and bring them here.
OK, lovely. Well, let's hope we can do that. Well, that's all from us this week. Many thanks to my guests, Emma Reynolds and Jeremy Wright. The new political week begins tomorrow when the Bromsgrove MP Sajid Javid will take his first parliamentary questions since his Communities and Local Government Department was expanded to include the political hot potato that is housing policy. We'll be keeping a close eye on that. Now it's back to Sarah. Bye-bye.
Welcome back. Now, the UKIP leader Henry Bolton faces his party's ruling body later today, who will decide whether they think he should be sacked after less than 4 months into the job. The showdown comes after a week of damaging headlines about his private life. 54-year-old Henry Bolton met 25-year-old Joe Marnie at a UKIP party last month. Then left his wife on the 23rd of December and spent Boxing Day with the former model. Last weekend, the Mail on Sunday revealed that Ms Marnie had sent racist text messages about Prince Harry's fiancée, Meghan Markle. She said Harry's black American fiancée would taint the royal family with her seed and pave the way for a black king. On Monday, she was suspended from UKIP, and Mr Bolton said he would end the romantic element of the relationship. But just 2 days later, they were spotted having dinner at a swanky restaurant in Westminster. She later went back to his flat, but Mr Bolton insists that was just to collect her bags, and he provided a taxi receipt to prove it. He says he still loves her. It was the happiest I've been in years during their whirlwind romance, and he hasn't ruled out rekindling the relationship. Well, Henry Bolton joins us now to talk about whether you can rekindle your relationship with your ruling executive in your party. You're facing the meeting later today. What do you expect the outcome will be? Will they vote to have confidence in you or not?
Well, I don't want to predict the outcome of that meeting, but of course the meeting was set up to discuss the present situation. They may decide to have a vote of no confidence, and if they do, then that goes to, and if that goes against me, then it goes to the membership. The membership.
Well, you could at that point say the National Executive Committee of my own party don't have confidence in me and leader, I better stand down.
I could do, but I shan't.
You would?
No, I won't. I mean, there are a number of elements here, but the most important is that the National Executive Committee should have its eye on the political ball, the need for the party to get itself on its feet and start delivering an effective message in terms of the Brexit debate and indeed how policies are shaped for the UK post-Brexit, how we ensure that we're a confident, optimistic, prosperous nation going forward.
They'll probably also have
important.
some questions about your personal life, and this is an opportunity for you to clear some of this up. On Monday, you told us that your romantic relationship with Joe Marnie was over, and then you were seen having dinner together, and there were pictures of you on the tube going home after dinner. So is the relationship over or not?
I'm not going to go into the details of that relationship. That relationship has, in terms of the party, is now over. Miss Marnie has resigned. She resigned
suspended.
yesterday. No, she's resigned as of yesterday. Made an apology to all of the members yesterday for the embarrassment that she's caused and any disruption and problems she's caused for the party. And I think that that draws a line under that.
Well, it doesn't really draw a line under it because you you said publicly on Monday the relationship was over, right. And then you're seen having dinner with somebody whose views, as she made, as have been revealed, she had to apologise for. So, I mean, if we were to judge somebody by the company they keep, you oughtn't really to be having dinner with her, should you? Whether you have a romantic relationship or not.
We've put information out on the public domain now that shows, that proves that there is, if you like, a coup stroke insurgency going on within the party. Now, some of that information came from her. In addition, she'd had a number of death threats that she wanted to discuss, and she did indeed have to collect some things from my apartment. So that was all done. And
so
that's
you
why
will not
we
be
met
having
that
dinner
day.
with her again? We won't see any more pictures like
I may
this?
do. As I've said, the romantic element is over. It would be inhuman of me to just simply walk away and cut that link entirely. I am not going to do that. So that's quite simple.
But this is somebody who has embarrassed the party and the leadership by sending racist messages about Meghan Markle. But you think it's appropriate for you to continue?
I abhor the content of those messages. I've said that numerous times. They are appalling. And she has admitted that. I was shocked when I saw them. I in no way defend them. But what my job is now is to get the party on its feet so that we've got a solid base from which to project our politics into the Brexit debate. At the moment, everybody's talking about Brexit, but actually, leaving the European Union is not the point. The point is getting back our independence for this country in every area of government and administration.
To be honest,
that's
when
got
it
to be
comes
the
to
objective.
UKIP, it's not Brexit that people are talking about, it's your relationship with Jill Marney, and there are lots of people who frankly didn't know that you were the leader of UKIP until this hit the front pages.
Fine, so maybe they'll pay some more attention to our politics now.
Of getting UKIP into the Brexit debate, and instead this relationship has brought the party into disrepute. And surely if you want this to be about the politics, you should stand down and let somebody else do the job.
No. I'm now delivering the message as to what I'm doing with the party. We've got an agenda to move forward in terms of internal reform, to build that solid base from which to project those politics. That's absolutely necessary, and I would say they've been neglected or so for the last year. They need to be rebuilt, and then we can move forward politically. That's what I'm engaged in. That's my core purpose. So any other debate is a distraction, and I'm not going to let myself get drawn down that route. She's left the party, we move forward.
It was your behaviour that started this debate and this distraction. This wasn't forced on you.
So are we now talking about this leadership thing being a moral court as to what the state of my marriage and my personal relationships? What is important to the nation and to the voters and the 17.4 million people who voted to leave the European Union is that this country gets its independence back from Brussels and that we can move forward on that basis towards being a confident nation again.
But you're suggesting that we shouldn't have a prurient moral debate about whether or not it was right for you to leave your wife or right for you to have a much younger girlfriend. Actually, what people are upset about is you keeping company with somebody who has sent some pretty frankly offensive and racist messages, who would appear to have offensive views, and this is somebody you want to continue having some kind of relationship with, and that questions your judgment.
I don't think it questions my judgment, and I indeed will let others decide whether or not that's acceptable. But I do not think that it is good for British politics at all, or for the nation, to start focusing on somebody's domestic affairs rather than the politics that they are delivering. With this country, as I say, needs to work hard. This party needs to work hard to unite the various Leave campaigns, to mobilise them and to take forward the cause for independence for this country. And that's what I'm absolutely determined to do. And I'm not going to let this party be disrupted by internal squabbling, which has exploited my own domestic situation in order to cause problems. I am going to take this party forward on the basis of independence.
Cripple UKIP. Why?
Because it's going to disrupt us. It's going to take 3 to 5 months of a refocusing on that election to it's going to take us off the battlefield for the Brexit debate. We can't afford to do that politically. At the same time, the infighting that will result will give our political enemies more than enough ammunition to pull the party apart. In fact, the party, if the NEC makes the wrong decision today, the party will start doing that itself. Politically, this party cannot afford to have a leadership election now.
So just to be clear, regardless of whether or not the NEC vote to have confidence in you, you will try and stay on as party leader, and you will continue to have some kind of relationship with Joe Marney, even if it's not a romantic one.
I will remain in contact.
All right. Well, Henry Bolton, thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Isabel, Henry Bolton says he wants to refocus us onto the politics of UKIP and away from the damaging stories about his personal life. Do you think there's much chance?
I mean, I just find this whole story so depressing on so many levels. I think we're past the stage, or we should be past the stage, where we hold politicians so morally to account. I don't care about Henry Bolton's love life. It really isn't my business. I do care about the fact that it's the only thing I know about him, and it's the only thing I know about his leadership of the UK Independent Party at the moment. I don't mean to be rude, Henry, but I think that you're finished, I think UKIP's finished, and I think that the sooner that you accept that, the better it will be for all the people who care about Brexit and who care about the delivery of Brexit, because right now you can't focus on that. You are too busy, too distracted, sorting out this mess in your private life.
And because of course you have a situation where now Nigel Farage and Aaron Banks are talking about setting up a new movement separate to UKIP. I mean, is it time, frankly, to put the party to bed and to start something new?
Well, I think that will be dependent on the decision that the National Executive make this afternoon. If the National Executive decides to keep me as the leader, then we will be able to move forward with the agenda of reform that we've been talking about. If it decides to take another course of action, then I suspect Isabel's absolutely right. The only chance, and it is a difficult challenge, absolutely, but the only chance for this party is to be able to continue as it is in the present agenda of reforms that I've initiated and I'm taking forward. If we don't do that, then quite frankly, I think Isabel's probably correct. And indeed, it's a difficult challenge, as she suggests.
Tom Newton-Dunn?
Well, I think UKIP does have a future, actually. I would disagree a tiny bit with Isabel there. If only it can somehow stay together and stay coherent, which it patently isn't not at the moment, until Theresa May finally does the deal with the EU27. There will be compromises in this deal. There may even be payment for access to the single market for financial services, although, of course, Theresa May won't call it that. And it will be some form of a fudge, simply because it has to be. We've all heard Emmanuel Macron this morning. He is holding with Angela Merkel's hard line of no cherry picking. There is UKIP's opportunity to be the hardcore, impure Brexit fighters. They were accused Theresa May and the Conservative Party of betraying the spirit. But crucially, they do have to stay alive until that point. Personally, for Mr. Bolton, I just have a terrible feeling he's both going to lose his job and the girl after all this. I think which would be a terrible individual tragedy.
Steve Richards, I mean, is it necessary that there is a voice, whether it comes from Aaron Banks and Nigel Farage starting something new, whether it continues to be UKIP? Or is there not a wing of the Tory party, where Jacob Rees-Mogg on the programme earlier on, who's a pretty hard Brexiteer, are they not doing that job of holding the government to account and making sure that they get the kind of Brexit they think people voted for?
Partly, and some UKIP voters went to Labour at the last election because their concerns about being left behind, in inverted commas, were partly addressed by the Labour manifesto at the last election. It's also about the credibility of the voice. I mean, the problem that UKIP has had over the last 18 months is that all political parties are fragile. It's been the theme of the programme today. The other bigger ones are. But when you've had all these leadership contests, all of them triggered by wacky, absurd circumstances, the degree to which weightiness and credibility is sapped away is such that it's very difficult for a party to recover. So I'm more with Isabel. I think it's reached the point where, even though Brexit is this golden opportunity for UKIP, it has imploded to such an extent I can't see how it pulls back.
So would you welcome a return of Nigel Farage to the political scene?
Well, I would always welcome a return of Nigel Farage. I think he enlivens political debate. I think that nobody can doubt his passion for ensuring that Brexit is delivered in the way that voters who backed that in the referendum envisaged. And, you know, there's clearly a vacuum here. So bring it on, I say.
And do you think it's serious, the idea that him and Aaron Banks and some others might start something new?
Well, I don't know about Aaron Banks, but I certainly know that Mr Farage has the appetite. I know he's extremely worried about the fate of Brexit and whether really there will be some great betrayal of voters. And so I know that he's thinking very carefully about what to do next.
He's addicted to politics.
Would that worry the Prime Minister if Nigel Farage was to stride back centre stage?
Well, Tom identifies the space that this Brexit deal is going to disappoint a lot of people who voted Brexit. So there is political space there for a harder Brexit political force, but it has to have those other ingredients of weightiness, credibility and coherence that UKIP always struggled for.
Quick word, Tom.
And it also has to have a very, very persuasive narrator. And Nigel Farage, whether you like him or loathe him, a lot of people of the latter on the former, he absolutely is that. There has been no politician in the current generation who can argue and put forward a more persuasive case than Farage. And if he comes back, it's very bad news for the government.
OK, well, thank you very much to the panel and to all my guests today. And before we go, there is just time to tell tell you about a new podcast, Prime Minister's Questions with Andrew Neil. It will be available every Wednesday afternoon after Prime Minister's Questions, and it will have highlights and analysis from Andrew and his guests. You can listen and subscribe on your phone's podcast app or on the BBC iPlayer radio. That's all for today. I hope that you do join me again next Sunday at 11 o'clock here on BBC One. Until then, have a good week. Bye-bye.